What if the most terrifying dystopia is not built on oppression, but on comfort? Brave New World presents a society where happiness is engineered, suffering is eliminated, and individuality quietly disappears. In this review, we take a closer look at one of the 20th century's most influential dystopian novels and ask a simple question: how disturbing is a world where everyone is perfectly content? In today's review, we change the pace somewhat and begin a series on classic and influential dystopian science fiction. We will start this series with none other than Brave New World, the 288-page novel first published in the year 1932 by Aldous Huxley. Together with 1984, it represents one of the defining dystopian novels of the 20th century. These two works are frequently discussed either in unison or as counterpoints that illustrate different ways in which a future society may take a wrong turn. Naturally, both novels have been analyzed extensively in academic discussions, essays, and even dissertations. My focus here, however, will be somewhat different. Rather than approaching the novel purely from a literary or academic perspective, I will look at it from the viewpoint of an interested reader who, beyond acknowledging its literary significance, simply wishes to enjoy the reading experience and be entertained. A perfectly reasonable expectation in the case of Brave New World. Brave New World is set in a distant future where humanity lives under the rule of the world state, a society that has replaced family, religion, and individual ambition with engineered stability and consumerist happiness. Human beings are no longer born naturally, but are produced in artificial wombs and conditioned from childhood to accept their predetermined place within a rigid caste hierarchy. Social harmony is maintained through psychological conditioning, constant entertainment, and the widespread use of a pleasure-inducing drug called soma, ensuring that conflict, suffering, and even deep emotional attachments are largely eliminated. Within this carefully managed society, a few individuals begin to experience a vague sense of dissatisfaction. Among them are Bernard Marx, an unconventional psychologist who struggles to conform to social expectations, and Lenina Crown, a loyal citizen who nevertheless becomes entangled in Bernard's growing curiosity about the world beyond the rigid order of the world state. During a trip outside this controlled civilization, they encounter a community that lives according to older human traditions, where people age, suffer, worship, and form genuine familial bonds. This encounter ultimately introduces an outsider into the heart of the world state, someone raised beyond its conditioning who views its customs with both shock and fascination. Through this clash of perspectives, the novel explores profound questions about freedom, happiness, individuality, and the price society may pay for perfect stability. Rather than applying the Mohs scale of science fiction hardness to Brave New World, or to dystopian fiction in general, it may be more appropriate to classify such works using a somewhat tongue-in-cheek dystopometer. The higher the score on this scale, the more horrifying, unnatural, and fundamentally, dystopian the depicted society becomes. In this regard, Brave New World earns a score somewhere in the middle of the field. The society portrayed certainly contains unsettling elements. A rigid caste system partly enabled through perinatal intervention, the complete dissolution of familial bonds, the sedation of the population through drugs, and a largely vacuous and superficial culture. However, at the same time, there appears to be widespread prosperity, an absence of hunger or material hardship, and little to no overt brutality directed at dissenters. Individuals who fail to conform, such as Bernard Marx or his colleague Helmholtz Watson, are not executed or imprisoned, but instead exiled to more remote regions of the world state. While this removes them from the centers of power, it also allows them to pursue more meaningful and challenging lives. When it comes to the scale of the narrative world, the novel implies that the world state encompasses much of the globe. Nevertheless, the story itself focuses primarily on parts of the British Isles and a reservation located in New Mexico. The world state also feels somewhat amorphous, with few clear distinctions between different locations within its territory. As a result, the narrative setting sometimes feels narrower than one might initially expect from a supposedly global civilization. Regarding the impact and novelty that Brave New World brought to its readership upon publication, and in the decades since, there can be little doubt that the novel has left a lasting cultural impression. It continues to be cited as one of the two foundational models of dystopian fiction, and discussions about its themes remain common to this day. Nevertheless, the novel does not achieve the highest possible score in this category, as several authors have raised accusations of intellectual borrowing against Huxley. Commentators have pointed to similarities with earlier works that explored technologically managed societies. Among them are What Not, a prophetic comedy, and The Scientific Outlook. Others have noted parallels with The First Man in the Moon, particularly regarding its depiction of specialized castes and artificially produced generations. Perhaps the most frequently discussed comparison is with the novel We, an earlier dystopian work that portrays a similarly controlled and technologically rationalized society. While critics such as George Orwell himself suspected a connection, Huxley later claimed that he had written Brave New World before he had encountered Zamyatin's novel. Additional accusations have also appeared over time, including claims that certain elements resemble earlier Polish science fiction by Mieczysław Smolarski. However, many scholars argue that these similarities reflect broader cultural anxieties of the early 20th century, when rapid technological progress inspired widespread speculation about the future of society. In terms of the size of its cast, Brave New World features roughly 2 or 3 central protagonists and perhaps half a dozen notable supporting characters. This places it somewhere in the middle between two extremes. On the one hand, the intimacy of a chamber drama with only a handful of characters, and on the other, a sprawling narrative populated by a large ensemble of point-of-view figures. When it comes to critical reception, the usual metrics that I tend to employ, namely major literary awards and nominations, are somewhat difficult to apply here. Brave New World appears on numerous lists of the greatest novels of the 20th century, many of which would fall beyond the scope of this review. However, there is also no specific award that the novel received shortly after its publication. In terms of popular reception, the book enjoys a strong rating of roughly 4.1 out of 5 stars based on millions of reviews across the usual online review aggregators. The novel has also inspired numerous adaptations across theater, radio, film, and television. States productions include a notable 2015 theatrical adaptation by Dawn King, directed by James Dacre, which toured the United Kingdom. Radio dramatizations have appeared several times, including a 1956 broadcast by CBS Radio Workshop featuring narration by Aldous Huxley himself, as well as later adaptations by BBC Radio 4. On screen, the novel was adapted into television films in 1980 and 1998, while its themes also influenced other works. most notably Demolition Man. More recently, the story was adapted into a television series titled Brave New World, developed by David Weiner and released on the streaming platform Peacock in the year 2020, although the series was cancelled after a single season. From a modern perspective, the aspects that most clearly date Brave New World to its era are the absence of historical references beyond the 1920s, most notably the absence of World War II, as well as some of the technologies that appear somewhat outdated by contemporary standards. Aside from these elements, many of the novel's societal observations remain surprisingly relevant. Huxley explores the consequences of a society that abandons familiar bonds in favor of unrestricted hedonistic entertainment and superficial pleasure. Reproduction is separated entirely from sexuality, recreational drugs are normalized, and social life becomes dominated by consumerism, materialism, and the pursuit of status, notoriety, and fame. One could argue that these ideas anticipate aspects of today's social media culture. Furthermore, the notion that a population can be controlled through constant distraction remains strikingly relevant. At the same time, one could argue that this concept is merely a modern reinterpretation of the ancient principle of panem et circenses, bread and games, from the era of the Roman Empire. Overall, Brave New World remains a novel worth reading, not only for its literary importance, but also because many of its themes continue to resonate with contemporary society. It also provides the added benefit of cultural literacy. One can participate in discussions about the novel with a certain degree of confidence. At the same time, its satirical tone and occasionally exaggerated descriptions make it an entertaining read in its own right, something that cannot always be said about other dystopian works. Finally, with its relatively modest length of 288 pages, it is hardly an intimidating commitment. If you liked this video, you may also enjoy the other reviews and content on my channel. Feel free to leave a comment if you want to discuss the novels or if you want to suggest other books that I should review in the future. Please consider upvoting and subscribing, it is much appreciated. Thank you for watching, and until next time.